We're uncovering thought-provoking, life-changing truths straight from Cleveland to the world. We're modern-day hope dealers, and we're proud of it.
Welcome to the Substance TV podcast, where it's all about the conversation. Provocative issues, life hacks, and designing a legacy is what matters most. And now, your hosts, Jason Howard and Brian Del Turco.
Hey, Substance TV tribe, Jason Howard here along with Brian Del Turco, and we are so stoked to bring to you today round 2 of our breaking down Garry Ingram's story. This guy is incredible. I know you're not really supposed to have favorites, but I tell you what, this dude is up there in some of my favorites. I've just been in awe of his transparency, his forthrightness, not being afraid to tackle the uncomfortable stuff that comes along with our faith with Christ. Basically, Garry's story is this. If you missed last week, you're going to want to go back and listen to the first one because it's off the charts, man. I'm telling you, this kind of stuff pumps me up. This is what we need to be talking about right here. This is what changes lives right here, man, is God and his word, and then hearing each other's stories. And Garry's story, his wife's story, we had her episode a few weeks back ago, both part 1 and part 2, just off the charts. But basically, let me give you the lowdown, then I'm going to shut up and get out of the way. But Garry grew up in a Christian family. It wasn't a very warm Christian family. It was actually kind of harsh and cold. They went to a church. It was a very legalistic and unbalanced church, as Garry would describe it. And as a child, Garry began realizing that he was developing these strong, growing feelings and attractions towards men. And so, clearly in love with the Lord, he began to pray about it for years, begging God to take it away, because he had read in Scripture certain parts that was not to be the case, and just wrestled with that. So basically, he worked up enough nerve to go to the Christian leadership of the church and say, "Listen, I'm freaking battling here. Can you help me?" Unfortunately, they didn't know what to tell him. You know, they didn't know what to provide in terms of answers. No support, no help. So really, what does one do? One takes off and begins their journey. And Garry started out on this rebellious journey. He was looking for Mr. Right, experiencing all this quote-unquote sexual freedom. It just jacked up his life, took a toll on his life, and eventually God led him to this really cool, unusual church that not only took him in as he was, but offered to walk alongside of him, even in all his crap, garbage, weaknesses, immaturities. And over time, they began to disciple him. And these men brought him in, treated him as if he belonged, and totally wrecked his life, showed what the real love of Jesus looked like. And being in that relationship, they began to call out the masculinity in him and speak the word of God and speak life over him. He was called into the ministry. He pastored for a number of years, and he is telling everybody about his story and his wife's story. She was a lesbian for a number of years. Again, you're going to want to go back and listen to her testimony, just off the hook stuff. So I'm going to shut up and get out of the way. This is the good stuff, man. Out of all the series, this is probably one of our best series. This is the good stuff. Listen to last week with Garry, and it'll pick right up on this group of men that brought Garry in, even knowing the things that he was wrestling with. I'm going to shut up and get out of the way. Let's get into this now.
I don't know if you can understand, but for any dude coming out of homosexuality who grew up in the church and experienced a lot of shame and rejection by the church and by Christian men in particular and boys, the last place on earth I wanted to be was in a men's Bible study, and put me with the women. You know, I'd get them better and they'd get me better. But I knew that was an important part of my healing process. So I went out of obedience. And then several months later, we went to a Promise Keepers conference. And after that, I felt like, well, these guys are never going to be more spiritual than they are at this moment. And so I shared with them I just named it, really just homosexuality and pornography addiction and masturbation. And these are some of the things that I've just been battling with for years and years. And what was so beautiful about that is, I was hoping that no one would leave the room. I was afraid that somebody would get up and just walk out, and they didn't. The leader of the group got up and pulled me out of my chair, and he gave me this huge bear hug and said, "Garry, we are so glad that you're here and you belong with us." Now, I was in my early 30s, wow, and I had never heard those words or experienced that kind of physical affection by anybody in the church, by any men in the church, all of my life. And now, I let me just clarify. God did put a couple of good disciplers in my life in different places that I lived, but it was different to have like one guy that wanted to help and was discipling me. But there was something about having what I needed was the community of men. Like, I belonged in the community of men. And I felt like I was ostracized early on. And then I'm just like, screw y'all, I don't even want to be with you anyway. And so it left me in this weird place where I didn't struggle with transgenderism, but I felt like I was this third gendered thing that didn't fit in anywhere. Yeah. And so the other thing too is I really stayed bonded to my mom and my sister, and my 3 older brothers were old enough. They didn't want me running around with them and their buddies, and so all through my developmental years, I'm marinating in the world of the feminine. I was with girls at school. I'm with girls at church because they were the safe ones. And eventually they're the more interesting ones, to me. And so it was really in my 30s, the very early 30, 31, 32, that I began to feel like the Lord was just really leading me back into a solid place of being a man among men. And I felt like I was just a little child. And so at this church and in the company of these men, I became a man at that place, even though I was 30 years old.
Garry, can I ask, John Eldredge writes that it takes men to initiate men into manhood. Could you speak to that, Edge?
Yeah, well, I love a lot of what John Eldredge writes about. And, we did Wild at Heart there at the church and Waking the Dead. And absolutely. I think that, and one of the other quotes by John Eldredge I love too is, and my wife and I just used it a couple of weeks ago when we were teaching at a church, is that we hear a good deal about original sin and very little about original glory. And so, yes, I do believe that one of the things he says as well is that the only place for a man to have his masculinity built, not just the fact that he's male, but the true sense of masculinity as it connects to the image of God being in us as men, which is different from the image of God in us as women, is that comes directly from God into a man's life and through other men. Like women don't have the capacity to build up a man in his masculinity in the way that he deeply needs. And so that really does come from God and other men.
Mm-hmm.
So good.
And it seems there's such a dearth of that in our culture and in the church.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, even when you look at like the life of Jesus and John, of Paul and Timothy, and certainly when you look at the story in the Old Testament of David and Jonathan, and you look at that relationship they had, I mean, most men are totally squeamish about David and Jonathan's friendship. When you read it from start to finish, when David is lamenting Jonathan and saying that, and weeping over his death and saying, your love was beyond the love of women. Sadly, what frustrates me is that, the LGBT community, the community I was once a part of, loves to grab that, and make it out that, or try to portray David and Jonathan as bisexual. And that really frustrates me because what David and Jonathan had was this amazing brotherhood. They had what men need. Yep. And so in our culture today, it's either, I'm LGBT or I'm a straight guy, and I have to make sure that nobody makes a mistake in thinking that I belong to this other community. And so the walls become thick between men. Mm-hmm. And even men that are going to church, and I do believe that God has wired men and women very differently and put his image into us very differently, of equal value, but very differently. And I do think that, men do a lot of connecting around projects and that kind of thing. Certainly But I think that we put too much emphasis. We act as if by being together and doing a project, that's the totality of what we need. And it's not.
It's not.
That's right.
That may be the method of getting there, but we really do need to be able to receive from one another in deep ways. And Eldridge, again, he talks about that a father with his son, when they're working together and the father is helping the son, there's a substance like food that is passed from the father to the son. Mm-hmm. And if we don't get that, the beauty is that the church is God's second chance at that.
Yeah.
But most of us are so squeamish and so afraid of that we don't know what to do to pour into somebody else's life, Mm-hmm. And
lest it be misunderstood, right?
Right. Lest it be misunderstood
by observers or by the individual themselves.
Right. And oftentimes, of course, we know that pornography addiction, and this is another topic, but pornography addiction, sexual brokenness within the church amongst women definitely is increasing, but it's always been an issue with men and even Christian leaders, pastors even.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of sexual brokenness. And so many men are hiding in shame. Like they don't want to be known and to actually help one another, to actually pour into someone's life, to actually be a mentor in someone's life. We certainly don't have to be perfect by a long shot, but we ourselves have to be willing to be known by some. And too many times that's just not the case.
Wow.
Can I ask another tough question? Jack Hayford talks about the rinsing of the leader, that the leader needs to be rinsed. To what effect are the leaders in our churches, like, leadership sort of casts a shadow over what you lead, for good or for bad? If our pastors are caught in are entangled in pornography or homosexuality, to what extent is this affecting the church?
Well, the tentacles that go out into the church that have unbelievable impact is there's no way of actually knowing the full damage. But yeah, it's incredibly damaging. We can't lead people where we ourselves have not gone, or we're not right. So
it's like an intangible. It's an intangible dynamic, isn't it?
Well, it is. So you either have I've heard of stories, of course, where the whole topic of sexuality and pornography, it's just taboo that we don't even talk about those things. And some of that connects with the fact that the pastor doesn't want to talk about it because he can't really talk about it in any way that's authentic. And then we'll actually have pastors that will get up and preach these hellfire and brimstone messages that that set your hair on fire. And then you find out 5-10 years later that he was sexually abusing his daughters, or he was involved in some other sexual brokenness, and using kind of that vehement preaching, whatever, screaming as a way of alleviating his own soul.
Right. Yep. Wow.
Now, certainly most pastors, even I believe that most pastors I understand, having been a pastor at this very church that helped me, I went on staff with them for 12 years. And crazy of them. I got up and shared my testimony. It was a church of back then, it was a church of about 1,100, 1,200 adults. And I got up in 2 services and shared I had a 3 minutes, can you imagine, to share along with the pastor's message. And, but I was scared to death to do it, but I also knew it was time to do it. And I knew that I was taking a weapon out of the enemy's hand by doing it.
Yeah.
And so, I was amazed that men would still come up to me afterward, and they were still physically affectionate. They would still hug me. They wanted to spend time with me and gain insights that I had. I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. God really used those years of me ministering at that church to help me understand that I wasn't uniquely flawed. I mean, I've got my own stuff, but what I realized is men in general, heterosexual guys that have never dealt with homosexuality, many of them are as confused about what it means to be a man made in God's image as I was. They don't show it. They don't, they're putting on a front. And many of them don't know what it means to really make and keep their commitments to their wives, to their kids. And but there are so many pastors, even those that are caught up in pornography or whatever. And I get what do you do as a pastor when you start dabbling in that? Who do you go to?
Right.
The reality is we have to have community in order to break free of particularly of sexual sin. And, and so I think even well-meaning pastors that want to break out of it, they're terrified of losing their jobs. They're terrified of not, of damaging their family or whatever. And so they keep quiet, and they're just trying harder and harder to break the patterns unsuccessfully. And so I think that certainly pastors that are still struggling with this area, I think that they're good-hearted, and they would love to have help and support, but they don't know where to go and get it. Yeah. So I think the ones that, back to your question, Brian, I think the pastors that are making the most negative impact around the things that we're talking about, the pastors that make the most negative impact aren't those that are either dabbling or are really actively trying to break, like they're ashamed and they confess it as sin and they want to break free. The ones that are making the most damage are the ones that have given up on that, and they're just choosing to fully live into a double life.
I would not want to be in their shoes.
Mm-hmm. It's scary.
Ultimately.
And it's got to be hard to get up and preach a message on a Sunday morning when it's not terribly authentic in your own life.
And to give an account for how you stewarded your leadership over God's people.
Right.
I mean,
True.
And that's why we got to be slow to be put into a leadership position unless it really is of him, and to be very familiar with our brokenness and to be honest with our brokenness. Yep. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to keep the apple looking too shiny, you're going to have struggles in leadership. Yeah. Right.
So people ask me, can you be gay and Christian? Well, oftentimes we ask the wrong questions, and so therefore we don't have very good answers for those questions. Yeah. Like, is it inborn or is it a choice? Well, that's the wrong question. It's not as simplistic as that. So yes, I think that a person can wrestle with homosexuality and still be a Christian. Obviously, they can wrestle with the feelings. They might even sometimes blow it sexually and need to be in a place of repenting of that, but a true believer does repent of that. Mm-hmm. What is incompatible is a lifestyle of sin, whatever that is. It's not just homosexuality; it's just a lifestyle of sin. Sure. And when we give ourselves over to it, and we call what the Bible clearly says is evil, when we call that good, and we say that God is for it, and God is totally fine with it, I think that is completely incompatible with the gospel of Scripture.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back after this message. For years, artists of all sorts, film guys, musicians, muralists, you name it, have been supported by patrons. And it's no different here with Substance TV. Did you know that you can actually financially support us by going to patreon.com/Substance TV? Thanks so much for hanging with us. Now let's go ahead and jump back into the conversation. You have mentioned that there's this false teaching that's going around, and people are trying to justify this false teaching relating to sexuality within the church. Could you maybe jump into some of those concerns that come along with that?
Yep. Yeah. So let me just quickly say that while we do some work with individuals that reach out to us, and we certainly are happy to have people in our lives that are looking for help and support, our main emphasis in ministry is to equip the church. It's to equip leaders, because we know that what we are able to give is going to be exponential if we can help the church become healthy in this arena, right? So it's really working with leaders is our primary ministry thrust around all the issues that you just mentioned, Jason. And one of the huge concerns, and one of the things that I'm very passionate about, is that there are several different perspectives in the church. I mean, kind of buckets within the church, and there's probably some in between too. But one of the perspectives that some in the church, that more liberal churches or some mainline denominations that have really become liberal in a lot of ways, not just around human sexuality, but even questioning things like some of the essentials of the faith and who Jesus is and the virgin birth. I mean, all that kind of stuff is kind of up for grabs in some of these churches. Well, it stands to reason if those basics are going to be, if they're going to be uncertain about those, then, even when it comes to human sexuality, there's a lot of uncertainty, or not even just uncertainty. There's an embrace of anything and everything.
Yeah.
So there is a perspective in a number of churches that called pro-gay theology. That God is totally cool with sex between people of the same gender, and that's not a problem for him at all. It's on par with heterosexual marriage, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. This is the way you were born. This is the way God made you. Mm-hmm. And so that's a perspective that actually many churches have embraced. Ones that we would think that are more liberal in certainly the Episcopal Church, not every Episcopal church, but the denomination. PCUSA churches have certainly embraced that, and a number of other mainline denominations. The other perspective, which in some ways is almost more troubling to me, because I'm seeing churches, evangelical churches that are solid in so many other ways, are embracing a perspective that where people claim that they are celibate gay Christians. So they're saying, nope, we recognize that Scripture is clear about not having sex with people of the same gender, that's sin. There's no way of getting around that. But I'm still a quote unquote gay Christian. So I'm choosing to be celibate as a gay Christian. One of the issues, and this is taking many churches that are very solid, and the church's response to that is, well, it's not the pro-gay theology teaching, and so therefore they're saying you can't, don't have sex with people of the same gender, and so that's good, right? And yeah, that's good. However, what the church is missing is that people are tying their identity to their brokenness. They're marrying their broken desires, and if acted on, those desires would be sin. They're marrying that to their Christianity, and so identity actually means something. So there's two ways that we should be identified as believers. First of all, as human beings, even before following Jesus, we are men and women made in the image of God. Right. Everybody has that inherent, not just stamp, but that image of God sewn into us as male and female. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, our identity is in the fact that I am an image bearer of God. And then secondly, in the way that image bearing is redeemed is that I'm identified with Christ. I am in him, and he is in me, and that is my identity, period. So when you start taking other forms of identity, that I'm a gay Christian, but I'm celibate, when you start marrying that to our Christianity, I really firmly believe that even if a person is able to sustain that through their lifetime, which for many it does not happen, if people will land in that camp and say, "Oh, I get to own the label of being what I feel like, which is a gay Christian," and that feels wonderful to finally identify it that way, and I'm a part of this community that does the same thing. And then before too long, the truth is, it's too stinking hard to believe that there's no hope of transformation in my life. That's taken off the table with this group. That there's no hope of transformation. This will never change. And I will never be able to marry the opposite gender because I just don't have any attraction, which, by the way, the idea at one time in my life when I was bartending at the gay bar and involved with guys, the idea of being with a woman was as disgusting to me as it would be for a guy who's never dealt with homosexuality think about having sex with another guy. I mean, I was totally put off by thinking whenever that came up in my mind, it was like, oh, I could never do that. I can never leave this community because I could never be with a woman sexually or romantically. And so one of the things that is really problematic about this line of thinking is that people oftentimes don't stay there. It's a stepping stone to the other perspective that, I'm just going to be in this quote unquote monogamous. It can be serial monogamy, that doesn't, one after the other, but I'm going to be in this monogamous gay relationship and God's going to be cool with that. And so they begin to embrace pro-gay theology. But another thing that I am really concerned about as well is that when we embrace a brokenness and marry it to our identity, I think, especially when it comes to the things that we're talking about right now, sexuality and identity, I think that in many ways we stop becoming. We stop like as a man, if I'm going to be a man who is going to just sort of sit in this place where I'm a gay Christian, this is as good as it's ever going to get. I'm going to embrace the suffering that brings into my life, and there's no hope for transformation. And I'm just going to kind of build my life in this community of other celibate gay Christians. That becomes sort of its own subculture within the church. Mm-hmm. And there's a shared kind of identity that's really, frankly, very unhealthy. We don't fully identify with other men that don't deal with those things. I want to identify. There's two. The reality is there are two aspects of humanity: male and female. Period. And so, even though Facebook has lots of different genders that you can choose and for yourself, and I read an article that talked about thousands of genders out there. We could be any number of things. The truth is, from a biblical worldview perspective, we are male and female, period. And I no longer want to be a part of a subset where I'm a man, but then I'm somehow, on some other grid. No, I'm a man who happens to deal with some of these issues. You guys are men that happen to deal with your own issues, and every other man on the planet does too.
Yep.
Women, same thing, right? And so we're a part of the male population. And we need to keep becoming as men. And so one of the concerns I have in this celibate gay Christian movement is that in many respects, men still remain boys. They're not growing. They're not really
becoming a man or full development in masculinity.
I don't think it's that we stop becoming a man. When I say stop becoming, I think that we stall our growth.
We stall our personal growth and development.
As men made in the image of God.
I see.
I mean, intellectually, maybe in some ways emotionally, obviously physically, we still continue growing. Mm-hmm. But I think that we will, and we should for the rest of our lives, be exploring with God. What does it mean to be a man made in your image? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a woman made in your image? And what does it mean to be a man made in your image in relationship to other men and in relationship to women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, when we have taken ourselves, not because we have a gift of celibacy that's scriptural, but when we've taken ourselves out of the equation and we're now in this subculture called the celibate gay Christian, and that's the sort of the pool we swim in. When we do that, we actually we've decided how we're going to relate to women. We've decided how we're going to relate to other men. And oftentimes the other thing that's really of big concern is, even though some in that group would say, okay, you can't have sex, they see nothing wrong with soul ties or soulmates of the same gender.
Wow.
So you can be emotionally bound up, you can be emotionally enmeshed with each other, and that's a David and Jonathan kind of relationship, which of course it's not.
They think. Yeah.
And so that's also of very, very big concern. Mm-hmm. And so there's a variety of issues, I think, that the whole celibate gay Christian movement has embraced.
Man, so quickly it can begin to erode and tear at that truth fabric and just unravel it away. And then it's scary that people are doing this in mainstream. And I know that you travel around nationally, and I loved when we were down in Orlando and you had shared this, but you'd been to some very specific places, but we won't mention, but you were kind of shocked that this is being propagated and even encouraged in places that if we were to say right now, people, their mouths would drop open and they would be shocked that people are getting more comfortable with this.
Can we say, I mean, not maybe a specific name of a person but can we give some indication of how this has leached into the church with a capital C? Can we?
I don't want to say any church or ministry or a particular name. I feel uncomfortable with that. But
he mentioned some denominations, which we all know are struggling, Episcopalians.
Well, one of the things I can say, generally speaking, is that, I mean, there are some churches that are mega churches that have put out some phenomenal teaching material in the past that I've loved the teaching. I've loved their emphasis, loved reading the books of the pastors that. And I've come in more recent years to realize, and it's taken because I so valued them,
Yep.
I oftentimes assumed that, well, something's being taken out of context. It's a sound bite. It's this, it's that. And what I've realized with some of these churches, it breaks my heart to realize, oh my gosh, they're not only embracing celibate gay Christianity, they're actually embracing full-blown LGBT and pro-gay theology, which is shocking where they used to be.
These are mega churches that if we were to hear the name, we would be stunned.
Oh, we'd recognize.
Absolutely.
It would be highly
Absolutely.
recognizable, and we would be stunned.
Yep.
Yep. No doubt about that. Can I just quickly, I'm sorry, Jay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I just wanted to back up and say one thing about the celibate gay Christian movement again. Just in terms of, I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture that I think might help the listeners understand just how unhelpful that embracing a gay identity, even when we choose to be celibate, is. For any man who he may be married, he may be single, Christian guy that wants to follow Jesus. When we get married, obviously it isn't as if we only have eyes for our wife now, that all temptation, sexual temptation is gone. There's lots of married guys that are still dealing with pornography issues and that kind of thing. But even for the Christian man who is not looking at pornography regularly, is not sleeping around, but he still has a pull and a draw in that direction. He recognizes his temptation. If we were to do apples to apples and we were to say, okay, so it's celibate gay Christianity, that's a great label, then I think the rest of the population needs to start saying, hey, I'm Bob and I'm a fornicating Christian.
Right.
I'm not doing it, and unfortunately many are, but because I have the desire,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take that desire and marry it to my Christianity.
Right.
Well, if that's such a great thing, if we as the average population in the church thinks it's fine to say I'm a celibate gay Christian, then let's just say I'm a celibate fornicating Christian, because I still have those desires, or whatever, gossiping or lying, right? And I'm proud of it.
And I'm proud of it.
Right? I mean, so it doesn't, when you look at it in those terms, that simply does not make sense, honestly. No. And labels do have the power to define, not only define us, but also to put a ceiling over our growth and transformation. Mm-hmm. Again, Brian, that's more of what I was talking about, that we stop becoming, that we put a low ceiling over the ability of God to transform our life.
And it seems to me that gender is like upstream from so many other things, right? It's Genesis 1:26 to 28, which we've alluded. And so if you get it wrong there, and if you start labeling and identifying and celebrating that, then downstream from that, it's going to be virgin birth doctrine, or a whole host of issues.
It is.
And truths.
It unravels. It begins.
It unravels, as you were saying.
And
it's a good picture.
And isn't it? I mean, who's to say, unless we did a case study here, but don't you think that when you begin to do that, and those that identify themselves as gay Christians, it's a slippery slope. And what ends up happening is your identity is not like what you had said, it's found in Christ, but now it's found in this subset that we've created, not that He's created, but we've created.
Right.
And before we know it, that becomes more important, and we're hanging our hat on that more. And that slippery slope, we begin to now almost fall back into it. Man, oh man, oh man. I told you it was good. I told you. Oh my gosh. I just love this couple, man. I love this couple. I love Garry. I love his heart. When you meet him in person, you can see Jesus up in this dude. He is no joke. And I am just so proud that he is sharing his story. Listen, you've got a story. You've got a story, and your story really is important for somebody else, just like Garry. And so I want to encourage you today, make sure that you're writing down your story, you're journaling your story, make sure that you're telling your story. Your story is just a subset of a greater narrative that's out there. Brian and I talk about this all the time, but your story really does matter. And so much so that in Revelations, it talks about that the enemy is kicked in the mouth. This is a Jason Howard version. He's kicked in the teeth by what Jesus did, the blood of the Lamb, right? Jesus dying on the cross, but also by our story, the word of our testimony. And Garry's story is kicking butt and taking names. And so is his wife, Melissa. And we are just so proud to call them friends. They're such Christ-like people, and they're down to earth, and they're not freaking weird. And it's just so refreshing to be around people that love broken people and who are broken themselves, right? Like, I'm the first one in that line. I don't know about you, but this is where it's at, man. And so big shout out to Garry and his wife. And I'm excited to let you know that next week we are coming back, and Garry is setting it off, man, with a third episode that is just off the charts. Already this one clearly was crazy good. Number 3 is just as powerful. And you're going to want to think about sharing this episode with certain people. Now, please don't let this be an episode where if you have somebody that's struggling sexually, like, you throw it at them and you don't frame it right. Like, that's no bueno, right? So make sure that you're having a conversation with somebody that you love. You can be right, and you can come at somebody with the wrong tone, and you can totally ruin it all and like make the gap between them and Christ even wider. We don't want that, right? We want to win people over through love, and we want to correct and help people in a loving Christ-like way, just like what happened with Garry and his wife. So please don't just throw this at anyone, and don't just flippantly like share it. This is a hot topic, and we want it to be ingested well. We want it to be framed up well. But please consider asking the Lord who you should be sharing this with, and then frame it up right, and then shoot it over to them and let them hear about Garry's story. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. We love you guys. We appreciate you. Continue to pray for us in our ministry. What we're trying to do here, we're trying to bring substance into the podcasting world. We love you guys. Talk to you soon. Some people have asked us, how do we help you grow? Well, you can do that by going to patreon.com/Substance TV and getting more information there.
Thanks for listening to the Substance TV podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes to help us spread the Substance TV sweetness. Visit us at substancetv.org to stay up to date with the most current trending topics and events. Is there a topic you'd like to hear on the podcast? Have an opinion and want your voice to be heard? We want to hear from you. Call us at 216-505-0665 or email your questions to info@substancetv.org. See you next time. Substance TV, media that matters.